Others are like mine, a little bit more drastic, and I feel like God snatched me from the flames. Welcome to another episode of Living Life in Tune. I'm your host, Adam Lee. This is the show where we discuss everything that I believe needs to stay in tune in our life. Things like manhood and personal growth, purpose, influence, leadership. All these things that I believe need to stay in tune. We can't walk away from these areas of our life. We have to constantly be fine-tuning them. And that's what this is all about. This has really been helpful to me to communicate these things and to hopefully inspire some to really dig deep into these areas. This episode, I'm going to talk about keeping our story in tune. Your own personal story and the ability to tell your story. But before I do, I just want to remind you quickly, if you're listening to this on Apple or Spotify, you can also watch on YouTube. If you search Living Life in Tune, you'll find me on YouTube. And if you're watching this on YouTube, you can also subscribe and listen on Apple Podcasts and Spotify Music. So there you have it. Episode 6, Living Life in Tune. This is keeping your story in tune. And it's not just the ability to tell a story. This is the ability or skill to tell your own story. In the church community, we call this giving our testimony. Someone say testify. The ability to testify, to tell our story about the things that God has done in our life. Those of us with this faith, we know that this is actually how we overcome. We know that the Bible teaches us that we overcome by the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony. So I hope that this episode helps you sharpen your ability to tell your own story, and it refocuses you and me on the importance of being able to communicate our own story and how powerful it is. I was listening to a podcast earlier today, and I heard the president of Belmont University, Dr. Greg Jones, say something about halfway through the episode, and I will tag that in the description so you can search that podcast. Very, very good podcast. But he said something about storytelling that he noticed in his experience that since the pandemic, the COVID-19 and that whole season of our life, he's noticed that students and just the general public, we are hungry for better stories. And you can remember in this time the different stories we were fed and the different stories that were going around all throughout this pandemic. And I believe in what he was trying to communicate is that this generation and people now are hungry. There's a new hunger and almost a desperation for better stories. We want to hear better stories. We want to share better stories. And we want to be a part of better stories. We want to live a great story. So I thought that was interesting. And I'll link to that podcast. And it helped me think about what I'm going to say about keeping our testimony or our story in tune. I want to start by just giving my story. I'll try to keep this brief. In West Philadelphia, no, I'm just kidding. My story is I was the kid that moved around a lot before I got into high school. My parents moved us around, my brother and I was in a different school almost every year. Sometimes I would stay for a little bit longer, but it seemed like a different school and sometimes a different state and different houses and stuff. I moved around a lot before I got into high school. And so I never really grew up with a single group of friends. I always, before high school had very brief relationships and brief experiences and never really was rooted anywhere. So fast forward until I'm about 16 years old. We do move back to West Virginia. And I've lived in West Virginia ever since, actually, for the past 20 years now. and I have been able to put down solid roots. But at 16 years old, I like to tell my story. This is my story of coming to Christ, about coming to faith. And like I said, moved around a lot, and my parents tried to get me and my brother to be in church, and we didn't really want anything to do with that. But a buddy of mine who I actually used to skip school with, his name was Charles, and I had a homeroom with him, or one of the classes with him, when I was 16, and he invited me to church. He had told me that he started going to church and that he gave his life to Christ, and I didn't know anything about that really, but I liked Charles, and I wanted to hang out with him, so I ended up tagging along with him to youth group, and wouldn't you know it, I went to youth group with Charles, and I really was impressed with a lot of the things going on in that youth group. The youth pastor was preaching a really good message, and the youth band was playing really good music, and I had heard the gospel presented to me in a way I'd never heard it before in my life, and so I told Charles, I said, I'm going to go home and give my life to Christ. I really feel like I need to. This is what's been missing in my life. So I did that. I can remember the room I was in. I can remember the prayer I prayed. I can remember everything about my salvation experience. And so that was when I was 16 years old. And of course, after that, I began to volunteer a lot in the church. I am now a pastor at that same church I got saved in. I've been working there for 12 years. Along the way, I met my wife, and we have two beautiful kids together. And 16 years old, that's when my salvation story was. And I've been faithfully serving in ministry since then. And that's where I'm at now, 35 years old, working full-time in a church, and very excited about what God is doing in my life and where He's leading us as a family, and really, really excited about what the next 5 years and 10 years is going to bring. And I've been able to make amazing memories and all that with my family. And so this is my story. That's my testimony of receiving Christ. And I know all of our testimonies are different, and some of your testimonies of you coming to salvation are a lot more gradual, and you can't narrow it down to a time and a place. It's just faith in God is something you just always remember being a part of your life. That is a beautiful testimony. That's an awesome testimony. Others are like mine, a little bit more drastic, and I feel like God snatched me from the flames, so to speak. I was not living my life in tune. Let's just say that when I was 16 years old, I was very disrespectful and disobedient and into some very foolish things. And so some of your stories are a little bit more drastic, like mine was, and you can remember the date and the time. Here's what I'm getting at with this. Our stories are so powerful. Our stories are so powerful. We cannot neglect telling our stories. And again, this is how we overcome in life, by telling our story. So I want to encourage you to tell your story. Don't be afraid to share your life story, coming to Christ, and be able to share your experiences, and telling your story is a very, very, very powerful thing. So a couple things really quick about telling your story. I thought I'd give you a couple things. Number one, when sharing your story, you got to know the difference between personal and private. We don't want to overshare. There are parts of our story that I believe are just for us. We have to sometimes wait for the parts of our story to reach their redemptive potential, to be able to communicate them. And it's great wisdom in our lives for waiting for the right moment to tell certain parts of our stories. It would be just foolish to share all of your most intimate details with people. Don't do that. Wait for the Redeemer to bring your story to redemptive potential and really be wise about, okay, this part of my story is personal and I can share it. And then we have this part of my story that's private and that this is just between me and God. And what I hate to see is people get out here and just begin oversharing. And all of a sudden they're just bleeding all over themselves and all over everybody else. And that part of their story has not reached its redemptive potential yet. And they're still healing from it, and it just gets ugly. So we really have to know the difference between personal and private, and we have to have the wisdom to wait for the aspects of our story to reach redemptive potential. And God does have a plan and a purpose for every part of our life, and we do. Remember, we overcome when we share our stories. So another thing I want to say is don't share for selfish reasons. Don't share your story just to be heard or just to make yourself feel better. Don't tell your story if it's going to stain somebody else's story. So you might be tempted to share something about your life that will actually tarnish somebody else's story or harm somehow their reputation. I will say this, if your story harms somebody else's reputation, you're not ready to tell your story yet. Your story has not reached redemptive potential if you're not able to communicate it in a way that doesn't tarnish somebody else's story. And then if you're wanting recognition or praise, that's a good sign you're not ready to tell your story yet. So there's people who want to share their story just to be heard, feel better about themselves, just to tarnish somebody else's story, or just to receive praise or accolades or pats on the back. No, that is a story that is not worth telling yet. That it hasn't reached its full potential. You're not ready. So don't tell that yet. Don't tell that yet. The second thing I want to say is, besides what I said, wait. There are parts of your story that are personal that are worth telling now. And I think sometimes we keep things to ourselves, or we don't believe we have a story worth telling, or we think to ourselves, how in the world can anybody benefit from those couple of years of my life that didn't make sense? You know, I just don't understand how that could help anybody out. Well, let me tell you something. The benefits of telling your story are tremendous. The benefits. Listen to the benefits. Number one, I said this at the beginning. One of the benefits is this is how we overcome. The Bible makes it clear. We overcome by the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony. So by sharing your story with somebody or a group of people, we actually something happens in us where we overcome this part of ourselves. We stand on top of this part of ourselves. We transcend this part of our lives when we're able to share it and testify about it. This is how we overcome. So that's a benefit. Another one is that our personal stories connect us with people. Storytelling has a way of connecting us that nothing else does. Nothing else connects us to people like storytelling, especially painful stories. Any good movie, good book, or good poem or play, any story worth listening to, we connect to it quickly when there's some pain involved, when we can relate to the pain somebody's going through. Pain kind of is a universal uniter. It connects all of us. So you might be reserved to tell painful parts about your story, but I want to tell you that as you share those, remember, those things that have reached redemptive potential, you're ready to communicate it. When you share those painful moments about yourself, you actually establish a connection with people listening that invites them into an overcoming story as well. So the benefits of telling story, we have to be able to look at our lives. Now, I'm in a small group right now that I'm learning the ins and outs kind of a bird's eye view of counseling people, biblical counseling. I'm taking classes for that right now. And one of the things that I just learned about when we're talking with people, and one of the things that helps when we are struggling, is to be able to consider our lives in the timeline of when we were born, when we found faith in God, and then when we will meet Him and be glorified in heaven. It is a really simple process of saying, okay, my life started, and then my life was changed by God's love. And then at the end, my life will be joining Him forever, and I'll be glorified with Him. So it's a really simple process of zooming way out of our lives and saying, okay, this is when my life started. This is when God changed my life, and that ultimately I will be with Him. And this is a benefit of our story, is we can pinpoint the moment that we met God, and it can help reset our minds to, if we're in an emotional overwhelm, or if we're so stressed out we can't see straight. One of the benefits of being able to tell our story is to recalibrate our own minds and say, you know what? Yeah, I remember when I met God, and I remember what He did in my life, and He's been good to me, and ultimately I will be with Him, and He will glorify me in heaven. And one of the benefits of telling the story like that is it resets our minds, and it helps us when we're in an overwhelm to think through the simplicity sometimes of life. And that all happens by telling our story. And then the last thing I want to leave you with telling your story is this. Our story reaches maximum impact when we're able to transition from us being the hero of our stories to us being the guide to other people's stories. So this is actually leadership in a nutshell. When we make the transition from, okay, I'm going to tell my story because it's powerful. I'm going to tell my story because it helps me out. It helps me overcome. It helps me be the hero. It helps me connect with people. When we're able to transition from storytelling like that to storytelling, now we're inviting others into a powerful story. And our storytelling, we want to tell stories so other people are benefited and become the heroes of their own lives. Now that is when your storytelling reaches its maximum impact. This is how we lead. Leadership is about storytelling. Leadership is about giving people a story to join in. That's what this podcast was telling me, was talking about earlier. That I was listening to, is people are desperate to join a better story. They're desperate for their lives to tell a better story. So when we are able to tell our stories that have a direct impact on other people's stories, now we're really getting into the power of storytelling and testimony, because we can invite people into a better story. We can give people a story to join in. We can empower people to tell their stories and tell better stories with their lives. So from hero to guide, I wonder if you've made that transition. I wonder if you've thought about the skill set of telling your story. I wonder if you've thought about that this is a skill that needs to be developed, that it's a very powerful tool. And not only does it benefit us, but it has the potential to benefit everybody around us. This is how we lead. I wonder if you've thought about this skill recently. I hope today inspires you to sharpen this skill, because what I want to say at the end here is, what story will your marriage tell? You see where I'm going? What story will your family tell? What story will your life tell? And Man, what a powerful thing to consider what kind of stories we're telling. But it's even more powerful to think about it in the context of inspiring other people to have better stories. I want to invite my wife and kids into a story. Man, I want to run after God so hard and so fast, and I want my story to tell that story, and I want to invite my wife and children into that story, and we can invite people and lead people into better stories. What is the thing that at the end of the day, after 30 years from now, when I'm 65 years old, what do I want to look back and say, you know what? This is the story that my family told. This is the story that my life told. And be proud of the people that it inspired and of the lives that were changed because of the story. I want that to be true of me, and I want it to be true of you as well. What story will your life tell? So that's kind of it. Keeping your testimony in tune. Your testimony is not just for you. It is a tool that can be used. You can share your story. Trust me when I say this, there's a generation and this world right now is desperate for better stories, to tell better stories, share stories, and to be part of things that are bigger than themselves. And you have the ability to get that all started in your life by telling your story. Remember, don't tell it if it hasn't reached redemptive potential. Remember, there are benefits in telling that story. And remember, the pro hack, the life hack here is when you transition from being the hero of your story to the guide and making heroes out of everybody else because of your story. That is where all the magic starts to happen. So, I want to challenge you. Keep your storytelling in tune. Don't stop telling that story. It's powerful. And remember this, your life matters, so keep it in tune.